Did you know about legit slavery in Europe that ended only in 1974? And at some point it involved 58 million people, including my grandparents. Just think about it, all the population of Soviet Union that lived in villages were forced to work for the benefit of the government, with no passports, no right to leave their districts, and without real payment for their work. How did it become possible? Agriculture was very important for the economy of the early Soviet state. In the 1930s, most private property were forcibly taken away from peasants and transferred to the ownership of collective farms, basically to the state. Millions of people were deported or executed, in particular during Holodomor, the artificial famine in Ukraine. From now on, peasants were obligated to work on the fields in collective farms. In 1932, the authorities in Moscow decided to provide passports to all residents of cities, but not of rural areas. It was state-level discrimination. People from the village didn't have the same right as people from the city. Why we can call it slavery? The life of a villager was controlled by the state through threats and violence. Each peasant was tied up to a certain collective farm. Every child from the village reaching the age of 16 automatically became a member of a collective farm. Getting the opportunity to go to another place to find another job or get education was possible only with the special permission of the collective farm manager. If a peasant traveled outside his district without permission, he was punished with a large fine or ended up in prison for up to 3 years. A peasant had to do mandatory work with no real payment. Each one had a certain amount of work to do, often so enormous that people worked without days off. Most of the time, until 1966, peasants didn't receive money for their work. As a payment, once a year they get a share of the production leftovers of the collective farm. For example, it could be 100 kilograms of grain or nothing at all. How people managed to survive then? The state left them small gardens near their houses. So, after hard work for a collective farm, people had to do additional work to provide for their families. Work conditions often were quite awful. Agricultural production in USSR was technologically behind developed countries. Poor medical care, no real maternity leave, child labor. Children older than 12 were actively involved in work of collective farms. Being a child, my mother had to spend time in the fields, sometimes instead of classes at school. The scale of this was impressive. Depending on the time period, it was from 20% to more than half of the entire population of the Soviet country. For example, in 1967, there were 58 million village residents over 16 years old, or 37% of the population. Add to all of this widespread discrimination against people from the country. When some of them were able to move in the city, they considered as second-class people. They were treated with contempt, as less educated, naive or stupid, and basically enslaved. Also, people from the country spoke mostly their native languages, for example, Ukrainian or Belarusian, when cities were Russified, so most people were spoken Russia, at least in public, so we feel the results of that even nowadays. Only in 1974, the authorities in Moscow gave peasants received the right to have a passport. In particular, this was because the Soviet state no longer needed so many people involved in agriculture, but needed more blue-collar workers. The collective farm system itself did not fundamentally change. Some people at least were able to move to the cities, mostly to work in the most harmful industries. All peasants were able to actually get documents only in 1981. There were 10 years left before the collapse of the Soviet Union. The consequences of that Soviet system we can feel even nowadays. Please leave a comment under this video and subscribe to this channel. This is very important to spread the information. Thank you.